The autumn wind whipped across the concrete rooftop of the abandoned warehouse, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city below. Marcus Chen adjusted his military academy jacket and checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. The other 4 cadets stood in a loose circle around him, their breath visible in the cold October air. "He should be here any minute," whispered Jake Morrison, the tallest of the group, his voice barely audible over the wind. Jake had always been the instigator, the one who pushed boundaries and convinced others to follow his lead. At 19, he carried himself with the false confidence that came from a privileged upbringing and 2 years at the prestigious Riverside Military Academy. The plan had seemed simple enough when Jake had pitched it 3 weeks ago in their dormitory. A new maintenance worker had started at the academy, an older man in his 50s who kept to himself and rarely spoke to anyone. The cadets had noticed him eating lunch alone every day, always reading a worn paperback book, never engaging with the younger staff members who tried to include him in conversations. "Guy's probably some loser who couldn't make it in the real world," Jake had said, sprawled across his bunk bed. "Living in that tiny apartment off campus, working a dead-end job. We should teach him a lesson about respect." The others had been reluctant at first. Marcus, whose parents had immigrated from Taiwan and worked 2 jobs each to afford his academy tuition, felt uncomfortable with the idea. Sarah Williams, the only female in their tight-knit group, had openly questioned whether they should be targeting someone who was just trying to make a living. Even Tommy Rodriguez and Kevin Park had expressed doubts about Jake's increasingly elaborate scheme. But Jake was persuasive. He reminded them of the man's behavior during the previous week's dormitory inspection. The maintenance worker, whose name they had learned was David Harrison, had quietly reported several violations he had discovered in their rooms. Nothing major, just some contraband snacks and a small flask of alcohol that Kevin had been hiding. But the report had resulted in weekend detention for all of them, and Jake had taken it personally. "He's trying to make himself look good by throwing us under the bus," Jake had argued, probably hoping the administration will notice him and give him a promotion. "We can't let people like that walk all over us." The plan had evolved over several late-night discussions. They would lure Harrison to the rooftop of the old warehouse just outside the academy grounds, using a fake maintenance request. Once there, they would intimidate him, maybe rough him up a little, and make it clear that he should mind his own business in the future. Nothing too serious, Jake assured them. Just enough to send a message. Sarah had been the first to fully embrace the plan after Jake convinced her that Harrison had been making inappropriate comments about female cadets. It was a lie, but Sarah's own experiences with harassment at her previous school made her eager to take action against what she perceived as another predator. Tommy and Kevin had eventually agreed after Jake promised them that they would keep things under control and avoid any serious injury. Marcus had been the last holdout, but peer pressure and his desire to fit in with the group had finally won out over his better judgment. He had been struggling academically and socially since arriving at the academy, and the acceptance of this tight-knit group had meant everything to him. The thought of being excluded, of going back to eating lunch alone and struggling through difficult courses without study partners, had been too much to bear. Now, standing on the windy rooftop as shadows lengthened across the city, Marcus was beginning to question his decision. The abandoned warehouse felt like the perfect setting for something to go wrong. The building had been empty for over a year, its windows boarded up and its entrance secured with chains that Jake had somehow managed to cut through earlier that afternoon. "What if he doesn't show up?" asked Tommy, shifting nervously from foot to foot. Tommy was the youngest of the group at 18, and despite his muscular build from years of wrestling, he had always been more of a follower than a leader. His involvement in the plan seemed to surprise even himself. "He'll show up," Jake replied with confidence. "I sent that maintenance request from the Academy's official email system, made it sound urgent, like there was a safety issue with the building's communication equipment. Said he needed to check the rooftop installations before tomorrow morning. Kevin Park, whose technical skills had made the email forgery possible, looked uncomfortable with his contribution to the scheme. Kevin was usually the voice of reason in their group, the one who helped others with their homework and mediated disputes. His participation in this plan was so out of character that he had been questioning his own motives for days. Maybe we should just tell him there was a mistake and send him back, Kevin suggested quietly. We could say the work order was canceled. Are you kidding me? Jake's voice rose slightly before he caught himself and lowered it again. After all the planning we've done? After what he put us through with that inspection report? No way. We're going through with this. Sarah pulled her academy jacket tighter around herself and walked to the edge of the rooftop, looking down at the street below. From their vantage point, 5 stories up, the passing cars looked like toys, and the people walking on the sidewalks were barely visible in the gathering dusk. The isolation of their location was beginning to feel less like an advantage and more like a potential trap. I keep thinking about what my older brother told me about hazing incidents, Sarah said, turning back to face the group. He said they always start small, but they have a way of escalating beyond what anyone planned. This isn't hazing, Jake protested. This is just evening the score. The guy disrespected us, and we're going to make sure he understands that there are consequences for his actions. But even as he spoke, Jake could feel his own certainty beginning to waver. The plan had seemed much more reasonable when they were discussing it in the safety of their dormitory, surrounded by familiar surroundings and the structured environment of academy life. Out here, in the cold wind and gathering darkness, it felt different, more serious, more dangerous. Marcus checked his watch again and realized that Harrison was already 10 minutes late. For a brief moment, he hoped that the maintenance worker had simply decided not to come, that something about the email had seemed suspicious, and he had chosen to ignore it. But that hope was quickly dashed when they heard the distinctive sound of footsteps echoing in the stairwell of the building below. "That's him," whispered Tommy, and suddenly the casual conversation that had been helping to calm their nerves disappeared entirely. The footsteps grew louder as they approached the rooftop access door. All 5 cadets positioned themselves according to the plan they had rehearsed. Jake and Tommy near the door, ready to block any attempt at retreat. Sarah and Kevin flanking the open area where they expected Harrison to emerge. And Marcus positioned near the rooftop's far edge, ready to cut off any escape route in that direction. The door opened with a rusty creak, and David Harrison stepped onto the rooftop, carrying a small toolbox and wearing the standard maintenance uniform that had become familiar to all the students at the academy. He was shorter than Marcus had remembered, probably around 5 feet 8 inches, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent working outdoors. There was something about his posture and the way he moved that seemed different from the somewhat shuffling gait they had observed during his daily rounds at the academy. "Is anyone there?" Harrison called out, squinting in the dim light. "I received a work order about communication equipment that needed immediate attention." For a moment, none of the cadets responded. The reality of their situation was suddenly hitting them with full force. This wasn't a game or a theoretical discussion in their dormitory. This was a real person, someone's father or husband, who had simply shown up to do what he thought was his job. Jake was the first to recover his composure, stepping out of the shadows near the door and positioning himself so that Harrison couldn't easily retreat back down the stairs. "Yeah, we're here," Jake said, his voice carrying a forced casualness that didn't quite mask the tension underneath. "We've been waiting for you, David." Harrison's expression changed slightly when he realized that the people who had summoned him were cadets from the academy. His eyes moved quickly from face to face, taking in their positions and the way they had arranged themselves around the rooftop space. There was something about his assessment of the situation that seemed more thorough and professional than what the cadets had expected from a simple maintenance worker. I don't understand, Harrison said carefully, setting his toolbox down but keeping his hands free. The work order said there was an urgent safety issue with the communication equipment. Are you boys and girls supposed to be here? We're exactly where we're supposed to be, Jake replied, taking a step closer. The question is whether you understand why you're here. The other cadets began to move into their planned positions, but something about Harrison's demeanor was making them all feel less confident than they had expected. Instead of the fear or confusion they had anticipated, there was a calmness about the man that seemed almost out of place given the circumstances. Sarah found herself studying Harrison more closely as she moved to her assigned position. There was something about the way he held himself, the way his eyes continued to track all of their movements simultaneously, that reminded her of the combat veterans who sometimes visited the academy to speak about their experiences. It was a kind of alertness that seemed both relaxed and ready, like a coiled spring that could respond instantly to any threat. "Look," Harrison said, his voice remaining steady and reasonable. "If this is about the inspection report from last week, I was just doing my job. I didn't write those reports to get anyone in trouble. I'm required to document safety violations when I find them." "Right," Jake said, his voice taking on a harder edge. "Just doing your job. Just like you're probably going to run back to the administration and report this little meeting, right?" Harrison's eyes narrowed slightly, and for the first time, the cadets caught a glimpse of something that looked less like the accommodating maintenance worker they thought they knew, and more like someone who had faced real danger before. "Son," Harrison said quietly, "I think you and your friends need to step back and think very carefully about what you're planning to do here." The wind picked up again, sending a plastic bottle skittering across the rooftop, with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence that followed Harrison's words. Marcus felt his heart rate increasing as he realized that they had reached a point of no return. Whatever happened next would change all of their lives, and he was no longer certain that they had chosen the right path. Jake took another step forward, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What we're planning," he said, "is to make sure you understand your place around here. You're just a maintenance worker. You clean toilets and fix broken faucets. You don't get to play power games with Academy cadets." Harrison's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his weight settling into what looked like a more balanced stance. The change was subtle, but all 5 cadets noticed it, and the feeling that they had somehow miscalculated began to grow stronger. "I see," Harrison said, his voice carrying a new quality that none of them had heard before. "And you think that cornering someone on an isolated rooftop is the appropriate way to express your displeasure with my professional conduct?" The question hung in the air between them, and for the first time since hatching their plan, the cadets began to realize that they might not be in as much control of the situation as they had believed. The tension on the rooftop grew thicker with each passing second. Harrison remained motionless in the center of their loose circle, his eyes continuing their systematic assessment of each cadet's position. The casual confidence that had carried the students through weeks of planning was beginning to crack under the weight of reality. Tommy was the first to make an aggressive move, stepping forward with his wrestler's build and reaching out to grab Harrison's shoulder. "Look, old man, we just want to have a little conversation about respect and—" What happened next occurred so quickly that none of the cadets fully processed it until it was over. Harrison moved with a speed and precision that seemed to defy his age and appearance. His right hand intercepted Tommy's reaching arm, redirecting it with a fluid motion that sent the young wrestler stumbling past him. In the same instant, Harrison's left hand shot out and delivered a controlled strike to a specific point on Tommy's neck. Tommy dropped to his knees, gasping and clutching his throat, not seriously injured but completely incapacitated for the moment. The entire exchange had taken less than 3 seconds, and Harrison was already back in his original position, his breathing steady and his stance ready for whatever came next. "What the hell?" Jake shouted, his voice cracking with surprise and sudden fear. "What did you just do to him?" "I defended myself," Harrison replied calmly, his eyes never leaving the remaining cadets. "Your friend will be fine in a few minutes. It's just a pressure point technique that temporarily affects the vagus nerve. He can breathe, but he'll need a moment to recover." Sarah stared at the scene in shock, her mind struggling to reconcile what she had just witnessed with everything she thought she knew about the Academy's maintenance staff. The movement Harrison had used wasn't something you learned from self-defense videos or casual martial arts classes. It was the kind of precise, efficient technique that came from serious military training. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harrison studied her for a moment before responding. "That's an interesting question, Miss Williams. I suppose it depends on which version of my background you're interested in." The fact that he knew her name sent a chill through all of the remaining cadets. They had never introduced themselves during their brief encounters around the Academy, and the realization that he had taken the time to learn their identities suggested a level of awareness and preparation they hadn't anticipated. Marcus felt his legs beginning to shake as the implications of their situation became clearer. This wasn't going according to plan. Nothing about this felt like intimidating a submissive maintenance worker anymore. The man standing before them carried himself like someone who had faced real combat, real danger, and emerged victorious. "My name is David Harrison," the man continued, his voice maintaining that same steady, controlled tone. "I'm 52 years old, and I've been working maintenance at your academy for exactly 3 months. But I suppose those aren't the details you're really interested in right now." Kevin, whose technical skills had made their elaborate email scheme possible, found his voice. "How do you know our names?" Harrison's expression shifted slightly, showing what might have been amusement. "Son, I know a lot more than your names. I know that Marcus Chen transferred here from California after his parents made significant financial sacrifices to afford the tuition. I know that Sarah Williams chose this academy specifically because of its strong anti-harassment policies after a difficult experience at her previous school. I know that Kevin Park has been struggling with anxiety about disappointing his family's high academic expectations." He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I know that Tommy Rodriguez started wrestling in middle school to deal with bullying. And I know that Jake Morrison has been acting out increasingly dangerous scenarios because he's afraid that his wealthy father's influence is the only reason he was accepted here." The accuracy of his observations hit each cadet like a physical blow. These weren't just casual details that someone might pick up through occasional conversation. This was the kind of thorough background knowledge that required deliberate investigation and careful observation. "You've been watching us," Marcus said, his voice hollow with the realization that they had been operating under completely false assumptions about their intended victim. "I've been watching everyone," Harrison replied matter-of-factly. "It's what you do when you're responsible for security in an environment full of young people who sometimes make poor decisions." "Security?" Jake's voice rose in pitch, confusion and growing fear evident in every syllable. "You're a maintenance worker." Harrison reached slowly into his jacket pocket, moving deliberately to avoid any sudden motions that might be misinterpreted as aggressive. He withdrew a leather wallet and opened it, revealing an identification card that caught the light from the city below. "David Harrison, Naval Criminal Investigative Service, retired," he said quietly. 22 years active duty Navy, including 12 years with SEAL Team 6. 3 years with NCIS. Currently working private security consulting. The revelation hit the cadets like a thunderclap. Sarah actually took a step backward, her face pale in the dim light. Kevin made a small choking sound as the full weight of their miscalculation became clear. Even Jake, who had been the driving force behind their plan, seemed to shrink visibly as the implications sank in. Tommy, still on his knees but beginning to recover his breath, looked up at Harrison with new understanding. "You're not really a maintenance worker." "Oh, I'm definitely doing maintenance work," Harrison replied, returning his wallet to his pocket. "It's excellent cover for the real job. The Academy hired my consulting firm 6 months ago after receiving some credible threats against high-profile students. Parents who can afford elite military academies sometimes have enemies who might target their children." He gestured toward the building around them. "This warehouse, for example. We've been monitoring it for weeks because someone has been using it to observe the Academy grounds. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that the surveillance wasn't coming from external threats, but from students planning their own little operation." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face as he realized what Harrison was implying. "You knew about our plan." "I knew about your plan before you did," Harrison confirmed. "I've been monitoring digital communications, observing behavioral patterns, and tracking unusual activities. When Kevin accessed the Academy's email system to send that fake work order, it triggered automatic alerts that we had in place specifically to catch this kind of security breach." The wind picked up again, and this time the sound seemed ominous rather than merely atmospheric. The cadets found themselves trapped in a situation that had become far more serious than any of them had imagined. Harrison continued speaking, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "What you've done tonight constitutes conspiracy to commit assault, attempted assault on a federal contractor, and cybercrime related to unauthorized access of computer systems. Depending on how the next few minutes go, those charges could escalate significantly." Sarah's training from her family's military background kicked in, and she found herself analyzing their tactical position with new clarity. They were on a rooftop with limited escape routes, facing someone with superior training and complete knowledge of their intentions. Worse, they had essentially confessed to their crime simply by showing up and attempting to carry out their plan. "What do you want from us?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Harrison studied her with what looked like approval. "That's the right question, Miss Williams. What I want is to understand why 5 intelligent young people, all with promising futures ahead of them, decided to risk everything for what amounts to petty revenge against someone who was simply doing his job." Jake, who had been silent since the revelation of Harrison's true identity, finally found his voice. We thought you were just some nobody trying to get us in trouble for no reason. And that would have justified assault?" Harrison's question was delivered without judgment, but the moral weight of it was unmistakable. "No," Jake admitted, his earlier bravado completely gone. "No, it wouldn't have." Tommy had managed to get back to his feet, though he still looked shaky from Harrison's demonstration of controlled force. "Are you going to arrest us?" Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying each of their faces in turn. "That depends entirely on what happens next. You see, I'm not just here as security. I'm also here as someone who has worked with young people in high-stress situations for many years. I know the difference between real malice and poor judgment influenced by group dynamics." He walked slowly to the edge of the rooftop, maintaining enough distance to stay safe while giving the cadets space to process what they had learned. "I also know that each of you has been struggling with different pressures and challenges that made Jake's plan seem more appealing than it should have." Marcus felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as the full weight of his poor decision-making crashed down on him. "We're sorry," he said quietly. "We're really, really sorry." "Sorry is a good start," Harrison replied, "but it's not enough. You need to understand what you actually did here tonight and, more importantly, what you were prepared to do." He turned back to face them, his expression serious but not unsympathetic. "You lured someone to an isolated location with the intent to intimidate and physically assault them. You used your technical skills to commit fraud in the process. You planned this for weeks, which means it wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a deliberate conspiracy to commit crimes. Kevin spoke up, his voice barely audible over the wind. What can we do to make this right? Another good question, Harrison acknowledged. The legal system would typically handle this through criminal prosecution, expulsion from the academy, and permanent criminal records that would follow you for the rest of your lives. Is that what you think should happen? No, Sarah said quickly. But we understand if that's what has to happen. Harrison nodded approvingly. Accepting responsibility is important. But I'm more interested in whether you've learned something that might prevent this kind of decision-making in the future. He walked closer to the group again, his posture now less threatening and more instructional. You see, in my years of military service and security work, I've seen what happens when people decide that they have the right to use intimidation and violence to solve their problems. It never stays small, it never stays controlled, and it always destroys more lives than just those of the intended victims. Tommy, still feeling the effects of the pressure point technique, spoke with genuine remorse. We never really thought about what we were doing to you as a person. We just saw you as an obstacle or a problem to be dealt with. That's exactly right, Harrison confirmed. And that's the most dangerous part of what happened here tonight. When you stop seeing someone as a human being with their own life, their own struggles, their own family and dreams, that's when you become capable of real cruelty. The lights of the city twinkled below them as the cadets stood in silence, absorbing the weight of Harrison's words and the magnitude of their mistakes. Each of them was beginning to understand that their actions had consequences that extended far beyond their original intentions. So, what happens now? Jake asked, his voice small and uncertain. Harrison looked at his watch and then back at the group of young people who had tried to make him their victim. Now we find out whether you're capable of real change, or whether this was just the first step toward becoming the kind of people who solve problems with intimidation and violence. The wind continued to blow across the rooftop, but somehow the atmosphere had shifted from threatening to educational. The 5 cadets found themselves face to face not just with the consequences of their actions, but with a choice about who they wanted to become. The silence stretched across the rooftop as Harrison waited for the cadets to fully process their situation. The city lights below seemed to pulse, with the rhythm of normal life continuing, oblivious to the life-changing moment unfolding 5 stories above the street. For each of the young people standing in the cold wind, the next few minutes would determine whether their futures would be defined by this single night of poor judgment or whether they could find a path to redemption. Harrison broke the silence with a question that surprised them. Tell me about your families, not the facts I already know from my background research, but what they mean to you. Marcus was the first to respond, his voice shaky with emotion. My parents work 16-hour days to pay for this academy. My mother cleans office buildings before dawn and then works at a grocery store until evening. My father drives a delivery truck and does weekend construction work. They believe that education is the only way to break the cycle of struggle that has defined our family for generations. Sarah wiped at her eyes, though she tried to maintain her composure. My mom served 2 tours in Afghanistan as an army medic. She came home with PTSD and spent 3 years fighting to get proper treatment from the VA. She chose this academy for me because she thought the military structure would teach me discipline and honor. She trusted this place to make me into someone she could be proud of. Tommy's voice was barely audible when he spoke. My little sister looks up to me. She's only 12. But she tells everyone at her school that her big brother is training to be a military officer. She has my academy photo taped to her bedroom wall. I don't know how I would explain to her that I threw it all away to pick on someone who never did anything wrong. Kevin took a shuddering breath before continuing. My grandmother sold her house in Korea to help pay for my first year here. She's 84 years old and now lives in a small apartment because she believed that my education was more important than her comfort. She calls me every week to ask about my progress and tells me stories about how proud my grandfather would have been. Jake remained silent for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice hollow with the weight of his realization. My father built his entire business around the concept of integrity. He spent 30 years refusing to cut corners or compromise his principles, even when it cost him money. The company motto that he personally wrote is, "Character is what you do when no one is watching." I've heard him say that thousands of times, and tonight I proved that I learned nothing from it. Harrison listened to each confession without comment, his expression remaining neutral but attentive. When they had finished, he walked to the far edge of the rooftop and looked out over the city before turning back to face them. "Those are the stakes," he said quietly. "Not just your own futures, but the dreams and sacrifices of people who believed in you enough to invest everything in your potential. When you planned this assault, did you think about any of them?" "No," Sarah admitted. "We thought about ourselves, our anger, our wounded pride, our desire to feel powerful and in control." "That's honest," Harrison acknowledged. "And it's also exactly the kind of thinking that leads good people to do terrible things. The question now is whether you can develop the kind of character that would make your families proud, or whether this was just the first glimpse of who you really are." Tommy stepped forward, his earlier physical confidence replaced by genuine humility. "What can we do? I know saying sorry isn't enough, but we want to make this right somehow." Harrison studied the young wrestler for a moment before responding. "Making this right isn't going to be simple or easy. You've committed serious crimes, violated the Academy's honor code, and demonstrated that you're capable of planning and attempting to execute violence against an innocent person. The normal consequences for those actions would destroy your futures permanently." He paused, letting the weight of that reality settle over them. "However, I'm not interested in destroying young lives if there's a genuine possibility for rehabilitation and growth. So I'm going to offer you an alternative to criminal prosecution. But it's going to require more than just words of regret." Marcus felt a flutter of hope mixed with uncertainty. "What kind of alternative?" "First," Harrison said, pulling out his cell phone, "you're going to call your families. Right now, tonight. You're going to tell them exactly what you did, why you did it, and what the potential consequences could have been. No minimizing, no excuses, no leaving out uncomfortable details." The thought of making those calls sent waves of nausea through each of the cadets. Facing their families' disappointment and anger would be almost worse than any legal punishment. "Second," Harrison continued, "you're going to submit written confessions to the Academy administration and accept whatever disciplinary measures they deem appropriate, up to and including expulsion. Third, you're going to spend the next 6 months doing community service work that specifically involves helping vulnerable populations understand their rights and protect themselves from intimidation and assault. You'll work with domestic violence shelters, youth advocacy programs, and veteran support organizations." Sarah looked confused. "You're not pressing charges? I'm offering you the opportunity to prove that this was an aberration rather than a revelation of your true character," Harrison clarified. "But understand that this offer comes with conditions that are non-negotiable." He walked closer to the group, his expression serious and unwavering. "If any of you ever engages in intimidation, harassment, or violence again, I will personally ensure that you face the full legal consequences not just for that future incident, but for what happened here tonight. My report and evidence from this evening will be held in sealed files that can be opened if needed." Kevin swallowed hard before asking, "How will you know if we mess up again?" "Son," Harrison said with something that might have been amusement, "I'm a former Navy SEAL who now works in private security. If you think you can commit crimes without me finding out about it, you're seriously overestimating your abilities and underestimating mine. The reality of being permanently monitored by someone with Harrison's skills and resources was sobering. Jake realized that they would essentially be living the rest of their lives under the watch of someone who had already demonstrated his ability to anticipate and counter their actions. "There's one more condition," Harrison added. "You're going to meet with me once a month for the next year. Not for punishment, but for education. You're going to learn about the real consequences of violence, about the people whose lives are destroyed by others who think intimidation and assault are acceptable problem-solving tools." Tommy asked quietly, "Why are you giving us this chance? Why not just arrest us and let the system handle it?" Harrison was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because 25 years ago, I was a young Marine who made some serious mistakes in judgment. Not identical to yours, but serious enough that they could have ended my career and my life. I was fortunate enough to have a senior officer who believed that people could change if they were given the right kind of second chance." He looked each of them in the eye before continuing. "That officer told me that the real test of character isn't whether you make mistakes, because everyone does. The real test is what you do after you make them. Do you learn and grow, or do you make excuses and repeat the same patterns?" Marcus wiped tears from his face as the full impact of Harrison's offer began to sink in. "You're trusting us with our futures." "No," Harrison corrected. "I'm giving you the opportunity to take responsibility for your own futures. Whether you prove worthy of that trust is entirely up to you." The wind had died down, and the city sounds from below seemed to fade as the 5 cadets stood facing the most important decision of their young lives. Each of them understood that this moment would define not just their immediate futures, but the kind of people they would become. Sarah spoke first, her voice strong despite her tears. "I want to make those phone calls. I want to tell my mother what I did and ask her to help me understand how to be better." "Me too," Marcus said immediately. "My parents deserve to know the truth, and they deserve to know that I'm going to work to become worthy of their sacrifices." Tommy nodded firmly. "My sister needs to know that her big brother made a serious mistake, but that he's committed to learning from it and becoming someone she can truly look up to." Kevin's voice was barely a whisper, but his words were clear. "My grandmother has been through too much hardship for me to add to it by keeping this secret. She deserves honesty, and I deserve to face the consequences of my choices." All eyes turned to Jake, who had been silent during the others' declarations. He stood at the center of their group, the instigator who had convinced them all to participate in a plan that could have destroyed their lives. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse Harrison's offer, might choose to face legal prosecution rather than the harder path of admitting his mistakes to the people who loved him. Finally, he spoke, his voice heavy with genuine remorse. "I convinced these 4 people to risk everything they've worked for because I was too proud to accept that someone had the authority to hold me accountable for my actions. I turned my friends into potential criminals because I couldn't handle having my rule-breaking reported to the administration." He looked directly at Harrison. "I want to accept your offer, but I also want to do something more. I want to work with the Academy to develop better systems for helping students deal with authority conflicts before they escalate into situations like this." Harrison studied Jake for a long moment before nodding approvingly. "That's the kind of thinking that suggests you might actually learn something from this experience." As the group prepared to leave the rooftop and begin the difficult process of rebuilding their lives, Harrison offered one final piece of guidance. "Remember this feeling," he said quietly. "Remember how it feels to realize that your actions have consequences not just for yourself, but for everyone who believes in you. Remember how it feels to stand on the edge of losing everything because of choices driven by pride and anger. And remember that you have the power to ensure that you never have to feel this way again." 6 months later, the 5 former conspirators had each fulfilled the terms of their agreement with Harrison. Their community service work had exposed them to the real victims of intimidation and assault, giving them a deep understanding of the harm they had been prepared to inflict. Their monthly meetings with Harrison had provided them with tools for managing conflict and stress that they continued to use long after their formal obligations had ended. Marcus went on to graduate with honors and received a scholarship for graduate school. Sarah became a peer counselor specializing in helping other students navigate difficult social situations. Tommy started a program that paired older students with younger ones who were struggling with bullying. Kevin developed new security protocols that helped protect the Academy's computer systems while preserving student privacy. Jake worked with the administration to create a conflict resolution program that addressed many of the systemic issues that had contributed to their original plan. But perhaps most importantly, all five carried with them a deep understanding of how quickly good people can make terrible decisions when they allow pride and peer pressure to override their moral judgment. They became advocates for accountability, responsibility, and the kind of courage required to stand up against group dynamics that lead toward harm. David Harrison continued his work at the Academy, knowing that his decision to offer rehabilitation rather than punishment had been validated by 5 young people who chose to become better than their worst moment. In his monthly reports to the Academy administration, he noted that the most effective security measures weren't always surveillance cameras and access controls, but sometimes simply giving people the opportunity to prove that they could learn from their mistakes and grow into their better selves.